Iran already had to deal with 2 Marine expeditionary units heading toward its territory. Now, the US is about to do something historic. A powerful force is heading to the Strait of Hormuz, and it will change the way the strait is run forever. Elite paratroopers are en route. They're preparing to dominate Hormuz. Iran isn't ready for what's coming, as the US is moving up a gear in Operation Epic Fury. Following weeks of speculation about their deployment, the 82nd Airborne Division is being deployed to the Middle East. The Pentagon announced the news on March 24th, and it amounts to the US sending over 2,000 of its most elite paratroopers into the war zone that has been created in Iran. This is a huge escalation by the US, and it's another hint that the US may be drawing closer than ever to putting boots on the ground, perhaps on Karg Island as a means of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The Washington Post reports that US officials have approved written orders for the deployment, which have been sent to the 82nd Airborne Division's Fort Bragg headquarters, along with being sent to soldiers who are part of the unit's 1st Brigade combat team. This came in the wake of verbal orders having already been delivered. 2 sources close to the situation have told the outlet. Many of the soldiers who have received the orders are part of the 82nd Airborne Division's immediate response force, and it's here that we start seeing all of this get very serious. Why? Well, the clue is in the name, as the immediate response force has been created specifically to deploy within 18 hours of notice, and it's versatile enough to handle almost any ground-based operation handed to it. Taking airfields, such as the one on Karg Island, is among the force's many remits, as is seizing critical infrastructure, such as the oil pipelines and terminals that are on that very island. Task and Purpose offers more information about the 82nd's immediate response force, noting that the members of that force change every 6 months, as the responsibility switches between a trio of brigades. Upon being designated as IRF-1, that brigade's responsibility for half a year is to be the readiest of the 3 to be deployed. The structuring goes even deeper than that, as within the selected brigade are a battalion and a company dubbed IRB-1 and IRC-1 respectively, who will be the front-runners for deployment at a unit level. What we see here is that the US has created a force that is purpose-built to respond to emerging crises. What's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is nothing if not a crisis, especially as Iran's blockade of the strait has led to oil and gas price chaos. Pressure is being placed on the US by its international partners, along with non-partners who are being affected by the issues in the strait, and the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division may be America's answer in terms of how it's going to relieve that pressure. Karg Island will likely be the key. But what the US may have planned there could end up being an escalation too far in Operation Epic Fury. As for the 82nd, speculation has been rife for weeks that something like this is about to happen. On March 6th, the Washington Post reported that a big change of plans led to rumblings that the division was about to head out to Iran. Members of the 82nd Airborne Division had been scheduled to take part in a major training operation, only to have those plans be abruptly cancelled, leading to elite paratroopers being told to stay put in North Carolina rather than joining their colleagues in Fort Polk, Louisiana for the exercise. The Pentagon was cagey at the time. All it told reporters was, "Due to operation security, we do not discuss future or hypothetical movements." Now we know why the training was cancelled. The US had already been mulling options up to and including putting boots on the ground following the devastation of Iran's military infrastructure during the opening days of Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. With the Strait of Hormuz becoming a major problem for the US on the global geopolitical level, what started as a training cancellation has moved to full-on deployment. We still don't know what the 82nd will do once it arrives in the Persian Gulf region, but the odds are that a ground assault on Karg Island is high on the agenda. That's one option at least, but it seems increasingly likely that the US views occupying Karg Island as the key to taking control over the Strait of Hormuz problem. The 82nd has the ability to threaten targets in the Gulf region without having to directly transit the dangerous strait. Axios reports US Marine Colonel Mark Kansian, who is now a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies International Security Program, as stating, Karg Island falls into that remit, as the 7.7 square mile island is located to the northwest of the strategically vital strait, making it far enough away for the 82nd to avoid the strait entirely, though close enough and, as you'll soon find out, important enough to make capturing the island worthwhile for the US when it comes to reopening the strait. Karg Island is vital for Iran. Lying just 20 miles off the country's coast, the small island has a population of just 20,000 people, and most of those people are oil workers. That highlights what makes this island so vital for Iran, as those oil workers oversee a terminal that is the main point of departure for 90% of the oil that Iran sells to other nations. That oil is the Iranian regime's economic lifeline. In 2024, which is the most recent year for which we have concrete figures, Iran generated $43 billion from its oil sales, which was a $1 billion increase over the previous year. But the really important piece of the puzzle here, according to GIS reports, is that $43 billion accounted for 57% of Iran's total export revenue in 2024. So with 90% of Iran's oil moving through Karg Island before it can be sold, it's clear that the island is a major vulnerability for the regime. The logic here is obvious. Take Karg, and the US strips away more than half of Iran's export revenue, which would in turn cripple its economy. By sending the 82nd Airborne Division to the Persian Gulf, the US seems to be laying the groundwork for an occupation that has been rumored ever since airstrikes tore through Karg Island's military infrastructure on March 13th. But behind the bravado lurks some big issues if the plan is to have the 82nd Airborne attempt to take Karg Island. Those problems could change everything. But before we dive deeper into what they are, this is a quick reminder that if you're getting value from the channel, remember to hit subscribe so you never miss any of our analysis. Now, as impressive as the 82nd Airborne Division and its immediate response force undoubtedly are, especially in terms of their speed of deployment, the division isn't exactly set up for something like taking a piece of territory like Karg Island. At least that's according to Kansian, who tells Axios that the division is classified as light infantry, which means that it would be vulnerable while landing and if attacked by armor. Adding that there is a lack of nearby support for the division, Kansian adds, which seems to reference the fact that Iran and its missile launch sites are a lot closer to Karg Island than any friendly US bases, and it's clear that America's plan for applying pressure to Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz is more complicated than it first appears. The US has taken steps to overcome the armor challenge at least. We mentioned earlier that airstrikes against Karg Island's military infrastructure have already taken place. Presumably, that involved the destruction of the island's armor units, though it's also worth noting that these initial strikes took place about 2 weeks ago, at the time of this video's publication. Could Iran have moved more armor onto the island by now? It's possible, and that's a challenge for the US. Another counter to the argument that the 82nd Airborne Division won't be able to take Karg Island is that it's not the only unit that's heading into the Persian Gulf. Ahead of the announcement of the 82nd's deployment, the US has already sent a pair of Marine Expeditionary Units, or MEUs, in Iran's direction. The USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group, which includes 3 warships and 4,500 personnel, including the 31st MEU and its 2,200 members, is already en route from Okinawa, Japan. They're being joined by the 11th MEU, which is embarked from San Diego with the USS Boxer Amphibious Ready Group. That MEU has a similar number of members, so what we're seeing here is that the US is actually deploying several more thousand soldiers to the Persian Gulf than the unleashing of the 82nd Airborne would suggest. The involvement of the MEUs would change everything about a Karg Island takeover. These are amphibious assault groups that exist to overcome the types of challenges that Kansian says the 82nd will face if it attempts to take Karg Island alone. Time magazine notes that MEUs are also often the first ground forces to arrive at the scene of a conflict, and they combine hundreds of infantry troops with armored vehicles, helicopters, fighter jets, and artillery. Practically everything that could be needed to tackle an armored response on Karg Island by Iran. MEUs are contained forces designed to handle almost any situation, and the US is sending 2 of them to Iran, along with the 82nd Airborne Division. What we may be seeing here is the US attempting to counter for another of the challenges that comes with putting boots on the ground on Karg Island, which is that it's not necessarily taking the island that will be the problem. Behind that challenge lies the far bigger issue of holding Karg for as long as is needed to put pressure on Iran in the Strait of Hormuz. As huge a bargaining chip as taking Karg Island would deliver to the US for the Strait of Hormuz crisis, Iran has potential responses to US plans. One of those responses could be to slice off its collective nose to spite its face. In other words, Iran could emulate the acts of Saddam Hussein in the Kuwaiti oil fields during the Gulf War and simply burn the Karg Island oil facilities to the ground before the US gets its hands on them. That would take away the bargaining chip and give the US forces a massive fire to deal with from which they can't easily move upwind, especially if Iran times the destruction so that it occurs after America's forces have occupied. However, it would also mean that Iran destroys oil facilities that could take years for it to rebuild, which plunges the country into a multi-year economic crisis, no matter the outcome of Operation Epic Fury. That would be Iran's nuclear option. Another is to take advantage of the fact that Karg is close to the Iranian coast and about 140 miles away from the nearest US assets in Kuwait City. Resupplying the 82nd and the 2 MEUs tasked with taking Karg Island would be a challenge for the US, as would the fact that units stationed on the island become sitting ducks for Iran's missiles. Yes, Iran has lost most of its missile launch sites, roughly 75% of them as of March 5th. but it still has isolated and mobile launchers that it can roll out, use to fire missiles, and then send back into hiding. Karg Island is small enough that even a handful of strikes could be enough to devastate US troops, especially if there are hitches in setting up their defenses. These are all challenges that the US can overcome. The MEUs en route to the Gulf region still haven't arrived, and the 82nd Airborne Division is behind them. If Karg Island is the goal, the US is building up an appropriately sized force for taking and holding the island. It's likely that air defenses are being prepared, perhaps in Kuwait City, to send into Karg Island immediately after the occupation too. And US aerial assets continue to patrol the Iranian coastline. Missile launch sites are being destroyed, which helps to mitigate the sitting duck challenge. Still, the question has to be asked, is it really worth sending the 82nd Airborne and 2 MEUs into Karg Island? To the US, the answer is likely a resounding yes, though there is also another reason why all of this ground power could be heading to Iran. Before we explain what that is, the Karg Island occupation would be all about reopening the Strait of Hormuz. We've already told you that the island will be a major bargaining chip, and it's one that the US will be delighted to be able to play, given what's happening in the strait right now. This single waterway has mostly been blocked off by Iran since the start of Operation Epic Fury, which is an issue, given that 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through the strait. Iran has been playing the one major card that it has well, and we've seen the results over the past few weeks. According to Hellenic Shipping News, fewer than 100 merchant ships have managed to sail through the strait between the beginning of March and March 23rd. For context, almost 140 ships sailed through the Strait of Hormuz daily before Operation Epic Fury began. Now the average is down to 5 or 6, and most of those are sailing under Iran's flag or are linked to Tehran's regime. Iran has also started to look at the Strait of Hormuz situation as a way to pull in a little extra money. In a March 24th report, The Telegraph said that Iran has created regime-approved routes through the Strait of Hormuz that just happen to funnel ships into what amounts to a waterborne toll booth system. Fees for safe transit climb as high as $2 million, the outlet reports. Iran might claim that means it has reopened the strait. The US, and likely the rest of the world, would counter by pointing out that these fees are so ludicrously high that they're clearly designed to prevent all but the most desperate merchant ships from passing through. It wouldn't be accurate to claim that taking Karg Island would outright solve the Strait of Hormuz problem, but it would help. The billions that the US could take out of Iran's economy by controlling that island's oil infrastructure using its MEUs and the 82nd Airborne would create more pressure on the Iranian regime. That pressure would mount on top of the economic concerns that have led the regime to the position that it finds itself in right now. The US could offer access to Karg in exchange for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran would have to seriously consider that offer. But so far, we've looked at the boots-on-the-ground option. There is another. As Time reports, the US claims that ceasefire talks between the US and Iran have tentatively started. Well, maybe. There's a lot of confusion about those talks right now. According to US President Donald Trump, the talks are happening because Iran is completely desperate to make a deal following the destruction of so much of the regime's military infrastructure. On March 24th, Trump also declared that making sure that Iran has no nuclear weapons is a key American focus, and that the current regime has promised that it won't build any nukes. All of this is reportedly on top of a 15-point plan for a ceasefire that the US has created, which AP News says may include non-starter negotiation topics related to Iran's ballistic missile program and its support of regional militias and proxy groups. So progress, right? Not according to Iran. The Iranian military claimed on March 25th that the US is failing to achieve its goals and that it's essentially negotiating with itself. The spokesperson for the Unified Command of Iran's armed forces, Ebrahim Zolfikari, has said as much, declaring, "Has the level of your inner struggle reached the stage of you negotiating with yourself?" Before adding, "Don't call your failure an agreement." The BBC adds that many in Iran don't believe that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is willing to negotiate with the US, as it's too steadfast in its fundamentalist beliefs to allow even the destruction of huge swathes of its military infrastructure to sway them from its goals. It's difficult to untangle what's really going on when both sides are sending such different messages, and that may reveal the real reason why the 82nd Airborne Division is heading to the Persian Gulf. The occupation of Karg Island is still very much a possibility, but what we may be seeing right now is that Trump is buying time with his talks about negotiations, which he is using to purposefully create confusion in Iran. After all, Iran's regime is in a rough spot. Fracturing has clearly occurred after multiple levels of leadership were taken out, so communication within the regime may not be as on point as it needs to be. Maybe some in the regime are talking to the US while others think no negotiations are happening. Who knows? And that's the point. Trump may be playing into the situation while more US troops head toward Iran. As all of this is happening, the 82nd is sailing. It's going to be joined by 2 MEUs. Even if Karg Island isn't on the agenda, this represents the US sending a clear message to Iran's regime. If negotiations aren't actually happening, then they need to start soon. The US is showing Iran that it's ready for any eventuality up to and including putting boots on the ground, and it's strengthening that particular part of its posture in the Persian Gulf region by the day. Something historic may well be about to go down in Iran, and it's what Iran fears most. The US has batted the ball into the Iranian regime's court. How the regime responds will determine what happens next. If the US is planning to take Karg Island to force the loss of Iranian control in the Strait of Hormuz, it's setting up well for the possibility. Before announcing the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division, the US unleashed massive bunker-busting bombs on underground missile sites throughout the Strait of Hormuz coast. Those strikes alone could reopen the critical waterway. You can find out all about them in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our Operation Epic Fury coverage. And thank you as always for watching.